Hi everyone, welcome to Tuesdays at Lunch with Dr. Blum for my discussions that I have every week. If you're new to our lunchtime visits, then I'll tell you today we're going to talk about adrenal fatigue. So if you remember, last week we all did a whole survey to figure out what everybody wanted me to talk about, and you all chose inflammation was number one, and that's the one I talked about last week. This week, I'm going to talk about number two, which is adrenal fatigue. And I hope that you're all thumbs up on that one. And after this Facebook Live, we'll put out another survey to decide what we're going to talk about next week. So for today, it'll be adrenal fatigue. And actually, it's very interesting because the word adrenal fatigue has become such a buzzword. Like everybody seems to know what it is, and in the integrative functional medicine world, we've been using that word, and we've been using the whole idea about adrenal fatigue for a lot of years. I think since I did my functional medicine training back in 2001. So it's been around a long time, and lately we're all sort of wondering if adrenal fatigue is really the right way to think about what's happening in the body, and some discussion about whether we should change the terminology to be more like adrenal dysfunction, or just, like dysfunctional adrenal glands or maladaptive adrenal glands, because we're not quite sure that fatigue, which suggests that they're completely shot, is really true for most people. And I will talk a little bit more about that. So an interesting topic and very timely, because like I said, there's a lot of discussion about what really it means to have adrenal fatigue, and what about all those people who have an impairment in their adrenal function before the adrenals really become poot. So let's circle back for a minute while we wait. At the beginning, everyone takes a few minutes to join us, and I'm just going to remind you that today, as I do every week on Tuesdays at lunch, I'll talk for 15 minutes, and I'll try not to talk too fast. I tend to do that. I'll talk for 15 minutes, and then I'll stop and I'll answer questions. So feel free to, and today I'm in my office and I have Sarah with me, so if you post any questions now, she could see the questions that come in earlier. Sometimes I don't see the ones I only see the ones that are rolling up on the screen. So we'll try to get to all your questions. Sarah's going to help me today, which is great. And so 15 minutes first, and so that's the first bit of housekeeping. The next thing I want to really start out with is to talk about what the adrenals are. So everybody's heard this word adrenal fatigue, but I know when I sit in my office and talk to people, or when I'm giving a talk, people sometimes I say, well, do you know what the adrenals are? And they go, I think so, but I'm not really sure. So let me share a little bit about what adrenals are and what they do. And that'll be actually the first step. Actually, I think, my water, if you don't mind? Thanks. I have a little frog in my throat today. The heat's on in my office, and so it's a little cool, hot and dry. Okay, so your adrenal glands, you have two adrenal glands. They sit on top of each kidney. I sort of think of them like a little head of hair sitting on top of each of your kidneys, and as you probably or might not know, your kidneys are on either side of your spine in your back, and they're actually higher than most people think because they're protected by your rib cage. So they're actually on either side of your spine, up underneath your rib cage. So you have two kidneys, and on top of them sit your adrenal glands. Now, the adrenal glands are one of your endocrine organs. And what's an endocrine organ? An endocrine gland or an endocrine organ secretes hormones. It makes stuff. It makes messengers that zip around your body, and the definition of a hormone is that it's released in one place and it has activity in another place. So a hormone is released in one place of the body, and it communicates with other cells at distant sites, and that's a hormone. And so your adrenal glands makes hormones. Both of them do. Adrenal glands makes hormone. And we'll talk about which hormones in a sec. But the point I wanted to make is that the other parts of your endocrine system, just to check in about the higher altitude view of looking at this from the top, is your adrenal glands, you have your thyroid, you have your ovaries or testes, right? Those all make hormones. So your thyroid makes thyroid hormone, Your testicles make testosterone. Actually, your ovaries make testosterone too, but the ovaries make estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. And then the leader, and actually I would also say that your pancreas is also an endocrine organ because it makes insulin. And that's another hormone that shoots around your body and has an effect. And the leader of the endocrine orchestra is your pituitary gland, which is in your brain. And so your brain sort of has the wand, and it leads the orchestra, and it tells the adrenals to make its hormones, it tells your thyroid to make its hormones, it tells your ovaries, etc. And that's called the HPA axis, for those of you who want to know some of the terminology. Anyway, back to your adrenals. So in the context of everything, I first want to say about the adrenals then is that in its role, I always often call it as the three sisters, the thyroid, adrenal, and your ovaries, or the thyroid, adrenal, and your testes, sex hormones, adrenals, and thyroid. They're three sisters, or a sister and a brother, but they all work together. And a lot of times, and some of the symptoms of deficiency in any of those three are similar. So if you low sex hormones, so what are some of those? Low sex hormones, low thyroid hormone, low adrenal hormones, you might feel tired and sluggish, and your hair might start falling out. And a lot of times people walk into my office and say, my thyroid, I have a problem with my thyroid, when in fact it might be one of the other endocrine gland, one of the other sister hormones that are the problem. So first rule of thumb is if you're having any kind of signs of what are the classic signs of adrenal fatigue or even hypothyroidism, you need to always check your adrenals, because the hormones made in the adrenals talk to the thyroid hormones and help them work. I'm going to say more about that in a minute. So that's the big picture, right? So adrenals are a very important player in your whole endocrine system. None of this operates by itself. Okay, so what hormones do the adrenals make? The adrenals make, think of the adrenals as having an inner part and an outer part. So the inner part of the adrenals are called the medulla, and the outer part is called the cortex. And in the adrenal cortex, your gland, that's the real endocrine hormone part, makes cortisol. That's sort of the famous adrenal hormone that we always check for in saliva testing, for example, and so which is commonly done, and we'll talk more about that towards the end. But so cortisol is made in your adrenal glands, but interestingly, especially after menopause and andropause, which is when men go through their changes as well, the adrenals also make sex hormones, because all of these are called steroid hormones, and they're all made from cholesterol. Okay, so remember that we don't like your cholesterol to be too low, because cholesterol makes all your steroid hormones. The adrenal cortex, the outer part of the adrenals, makes all of these hormones, cortisol being the primary one. And cortisol is called primary because if you don't have any cortisol, you die. The definition of a primary hormone. You can't live without it. There are secondary hormones made in the adrenal glands, and those are your sex hormones. So you make testosterone, you make estrogens, you make DHEA, which is an important adrenal hormone. So, and you also make aldosterone, which is an important hormone for regulating blood pressure. And that's important to think about when it comes to when we talk about a severe adrenal fatigue where the adrenals don't appear to be having much juice left to do anything. Often people have a very low blood pressure, right? Because the aldosterone might be low. And so that's the outer part of your adrenals. And on the inner part of your adrenals, is adrenaline. Okay, adrenals, adrenaline. That's how it gets its name. And the adrenals then respond to the brain telling it to make cortisol. So two responses happen in the adrenal glands when you're stressed. So the adrenals are your stress gland. They respond to a stressor. All right, so we'll talk about what stressors are in a sec, but let's just talk about the adrenal response. What are your adrenals supposed to do? Your adrenals are supposed to manage and respond to stress. And the main stress hormone is this cortisol, and that's a hormone. And the brain, the pituitary, tells the adrenals to release the cortisol. In addition, on the inner part of your adrenals is adrenaline. And adrenaline is really sort of a neurotransmitter. It's a little bit different. It's not. It also is a hormone. It's a hormone and neurotransmitter because it works in the nervous system, but it is released and it zips around your whole body. And so the adrenaline is when you're stressed and you have that fight or flight and you're going, and you want to run, and your heart's and you have palpitations, and you get this sort of amped up stress response. That's your adrenaline. And there's hard wiring from your whole nervous system into the adrenals that makes the adrenaline come out and zip around. And so that's your stress response, cortisol as well as adrenaline. Now, cortisol's job when you have a stress response is to suppress inflammation. Because think of it this way, if you were injured or your body had to, the stress response is actually, nature gave us a stress response to deal with stressors related to injury, right? If you think about injury or infection. And so cortisol is in charge of keeping everything calm, not overdoing it. If you're injured and you have to have wound healing, you have an inflammatory response, but cortisol helps keep things from getting runaway inflammation, right? Now this ties into what we talked about last week, because we were talking about inflammation and all the triggers. Well, when you have inflammation running amok in your body, cortisol's job is to put it out. And one of the ways it does that is it suppresses the immune system. Okay, so it suppresses the immune system. Another thing it does is it quiets your thyroid hormone and activity, because it wants to slow your metabolism down in order to sort of conserve your resources so you could fight the infection, heal the injury, run and hide, run from the lion, whatever it's supposed to be. And so there's all of this, suppressive effect on the body from cortisol. And as such, actually before I go to the as such, so you can see that cortisol is good for you. Nature gave us a stress response. We need to have a stress response, and that's okay. But just like putting the foot on the brake, you have to take the foot off the brake. And so there's an on switch, and it's really important to end up on the off switch. You have to take the foot off the gas, because acute stress or a stressor, when we all have stressors. We have somebody get sick, you get that call 3 o'clock in the morning, somebody's, there's a car accident, I don't know what, but then there's good stressors. There's getting married and, starting a new job, which is exciting, but maybe you had the getting rid of the old job, which wasn't. And so these are all stressors. And we all have to find a way to help the body not be in a perpetual stress response, because then it leads to something we call chronic stress. And chronic stress is when you never take your foot off the gas. And so what happens is, over time, if your foot's always on that pedal and you're pumping out cortisol over and over and over and over and over for a long period of time without relief, without giving the adrenals a chance to recover. Remember last week I talked about, and I love this, stress and recovery, stress and recovery, stress and recovery. It's the same thing for the immune system, stress and recovery, for inflammation, stress and recovery, for having too many toxins and then recovering from it. Our body has to have that resiliency to recover. And so you'll always have stressors, but you have to then have a break where you can recover. And the adrenals especially need that recovery time. And that's also why I tell people to go to sleep by 10, before 11 o'clock at night, even 10 o'clock. Because recovery time from 10 to 12 at night, your organs recover at night. You need to sleep. It's really good for those adrenals. And so acute stress is okay. And so it's adaptive, and we stress, but we have to recover. So how do you manage ongoing stress? Oh, let me turn adrenal fatigue. So when you're pumping out a lot of cortisol and you have this chronic sort of stressors in your life that you're not sort of getting a break from, or you're not giving your body a break from, the adrenals can start getting dysfunctional. They might start not being so adaptive. You might have low cortisol output sometimes and high when it shouldn't be. And cortisol is supposed to be in a 24-hour rhythm. It's supposed to be highest in the morning and then go down to the lowest point of the day is 2 a.m. And some people have curves that are just opposite, where they're rising cortisol at night, and that's going to keep you awake. Because one of the other things high cortisol does is raises your blood sugar. And I forgot to mention that. And it's a whole complicated story, right? And I hope I'm going to get this clear, help everybody feel clear about it. I forgot to mention the other thing about cortisol is that it raises blood sugar, right? So you can run and fight. And so I have people who have insulin resistance and they're developing diabetes, not from eating badly, but from chronic high cortisol levels. And that's the only thing we can figure out why their blood sugar's up, especially high cortisol at night and high fasting morning blood sugars. And so we work on stress at night and the blood sugars go down in the morning. It's actually really fascinating. So, but coming back to dysfunctional adrenals, your adrenals go through a whole period, and it could take years. Nobody knows how long it takes for one person versus the other. It depends on how bad your stressors are, how much reserve and resiliency you have in your adrenal glands. But during this period, it could take years. There's sort of this dysfunctional, imbalanced state where maybe you're not making enough, maybe you're having bursts and you're making too much at the wrong times, but you're not having really a good adrenal response to stress and then with recovery. And that's where I would say it's sort of the early stages of a dysfunctional adrenal gland, and not quite adrenal fatigue. I really reserve adrenal fatigue as a definition for people who are really flatlined. And by that I mean we use cortisol saliva testing to really evaluate the adrenals, because the cortisol, like I said, is different all day long. It's supposed to be highest in the morning. And so if you spit in a tube at home and do 4 samples from when you wake up till you go to sleep, we can sort of see the curve. And so when I do that curve with people and I see that the cortisol is like flat and low, 15 minutes, okay, we got to wrap this up and then I'll answer questions. When the cortisol is really, but I got to the definition of adrenal fatigue. So when the cortisol is flat and low, that's when we can say it's adrenal fatigue. And I don't want to leave you without talking about managing this. So that's the definition of everything. You can ask questions if you want to ask more about what it is and what it does. Sometimes there's that low adrenaline that sometimes it's hard to measure adrenaline. So you don't always know. We assume that once cortisol is low, the adrenaline's probably low too. But some people are stressed and wired. And if you're a stressed and wired person, you might actually still have pretty good like adrenaline firing with low cortisol. So there are ways to measure all these things. Like I said, the go-to is the saliva test for the cortisol. So I want you to think about, let's just talk about repairing your adrenals for a second. At the end of the day, you know, you all know me by now. I'm a mind-body medicine gal. I love meditation, and I've really been teaching mind-body medicine for, gosh, almost 20 years. Shout out to the Center for Mind-Body Medicine and Jim Gordon, who's been my mentor for all these almost 20 years. And think of it like we all are going to have stressors. We all live in a world where there are stressors around us. A stressor is something on the environment and the outside. And our stress response is something we have. So we might not be able to control our stressors, although I will put forth that you can control them a little bit, because you can make a choice about how much you're going to, you can make a choice about overscheduling yourself and making sure you're sleeping, and some things are a choice. But mostly we have external stressors we can't control, but we can control how it comes into our body. And that's the mind-body connection, right? And that's things like meditation and things like guided visualization. And there are all these great apps now, right? Where like, I love the Calm app. I give that to people all the time. You can download it for free. And you can learn to do yoga. It's relaxation. It's spending time every day taking your foot off the gas. Now, I do prefer the quieting kind of things, because in addition to relaxing your body, which will antidote and support your adrenals, antidote your stress response, the more quieting, meditative kind of practices give you a double bonus, and it gives you that sort of ability to get a little quiet and check in with yourself. That allows you to just listen to your deepest intuition and what's going on for yourself. It just helps, for me, it gives me that ability to check in with myself every day and know what's going on. Am I feeling anxious today? Why? Letting it bubble up and come into my awareness of what's really going on. So I do want to get to questions, but I just want to say that one last analogy that I love to use, and then we'll move on to questions. Think of the adrenals like a bathtub, and it's a bathtub that's filled with water. You want to have juicy, resilient adrenal glands that are filled with water. Now, a bathtub has a faucet in and it has a drain going out. And so you have to work on both fronts. You have to close the drain and you have to fill it with water. And closing the drain means looking around and reducing stressors. Don't be with that toxic person. Change your work schedule. Preventive scheduling. Make sure you're sleeping. Not sleeping enough. Things like that. Toxins in your life. There are ways to close the drain, right? So close the drain. The things that are draining your adrenals, you want to try to limit those. At the same time, you're putting in the water. So how do you repair our adrenals? It's really all lifestyle. It's getting a good night's sleep. It's practicing some sort of relaxation every day, so you're taking your foot off the gas and allowing your body to breathe and go into what's called the parasympathetic nervous system, opposite of the fight or flight, but the relaxation response, right? So you have to do that every day. You have to eat foods that are like low in sugar and toxins in your food. Your adrenals are part of your insulin and sugar response system. So food, so antioxidants, good vitamins and nutrients. The adrenals need vitamin C and B vitamins to work, and magnesium. So nourish your adrenals, right? So that's the water. And exercise, not too much, not too little. Moving every day. It's all lifestyle. So take care of yourself. That'll put the water in and close the drain for coming out. And then there are some really great herbs. There's like rhodiola, ashwagandha. There are herbs you can use to support your adrenals. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop there. I know I went over, so I'm sorry. Let's see. So is poor exercise tolerance linked to adrenal dysfunction, feeling faint or being physically ill? So it could be. Now there are a lot of other reasons why you might feel tired or have low exercise tolerance. But if you have adrenal fatigue or really low dysfunction, or you're not, if they're on the low ability to respond, don't forget exercise stresses the body. It's like a stressor. And so when you exercise, you're going to stress your body. And if your reserves are low, you might have trouble sort of managing that, and you don't have those reserves. And sometimes when I find that people have adrenal fatigue, I say, you know what? Do what you can for the next couple of months. Try to get out walking a couple of hours a week. That would be great if you can start there. And then once you have more energy, we can get there. Severe adrenal fatigue, sometimes people are low blood pressure, right? Because there's low aldosterone. And so you have to do some work before you can really tolerate intense levels of exercise. But don't forget, severe inability to exercise, I often think about the mitochondria, which are the little furnace inside your cells making energy, and I think about mitochondria dysfunction, which is maybe a topic for another day, about how do you make energy, and what's required of your muscles, when you, for people who can't tolerate exercise. So there's that one. Is there a difference in how adrenals respond to chronic and acute stress? Does it all read the same? So chronic and acute stress, the adrenals are going to respond to any stressor is going to trigger two things. A stressor is going to trigger a hormone response of cortisol from the adrenal cortex, and it's going to turn on the sympathetic fight or flight system, which is your adrenaline. And it's going to, that on switch goes on no matter what. The response of the adrenals will depend on whether so acute or chronic, it doesn't matter. The effort, the stressor, whether it's the same stressor that you've had for the past 5 years, or it's a new stressor, it's going to try to switch your system on the same. But the response that your adrenals are going to have depend on how long this has been going on. And initially, if your adrenals are very juicy and resilient, like we discussed earlier, if your adrenals are really juicy and resilient, you will mount a big cortisol response and a big adrenaline response. But over time of having chronic, ongoing, and the same stressor, your response won't be as brisk as it was before, partly because your system's going to be starting to decompensate. Now, I can't tell you when that'll happen, when it starts decompensating. Like I said, that depends on the person. Some people actually go for years with high output of their adrenals with their chronic stress. And some people, the adrenals sort of burn out, or get, start making less hormones sooner. And it really depends on their whole life. You have to do a whole history of your whole life. You have to take stock of the whole thing. What else have you been combating your whole life? How well you're taking care of yourself, how well you've been eating, how well you've been sleeping, how many stressors you've had to deal with. And so you might think you might not remember that you had some traumatic event 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but it turns out that stressors from early life or big traumatic stressors in your life count for later. They actually do something to your system that your system remembers. And so I think the definition of chronic stress is changing. But in either case, it's very important to be aware of your stressors, to reduce the stressors around you as much as you can, and to take care of yourself. We call it self-care. We can't survive in this world without taking care of ourselves. It just doesn't work. And especially as you get older. And remember I talked about the three different the thyroid, adrenals, and the sex hormones? When we go through menopause or andropause, as we get older, the system becomes even less resilient, which is why, you know, you feel even worse if your adrenals are tired. If you've had chronic stress and you go through the changes, or you're heading into your 50s, that's when people really start feeling off from the hormone changes. And so the adrenals are very important to participate in the whole orchestra to help you feeling your best. Let's say, okay, great. And so is there acupressure points you can massage to help support your adrenals? Oh gosh, I wish I knew the answer to that. I'm not really sure. Well, I know there are, but I'm just not the one to answer those. I actually absolutely love acupuncture for adrenal fatigue and for hormone balance at all, any kind of hormone balance. I actually do acupuncture every week. I probably do 2 or 3 times a month. I go to acupuncture for the past year because I did discover that after I felt like my adrenals were a little lower, I needed help balancing my system. And acupuncture is hands down one of my favorite ways to restore yourself. So I'm glad you asked that question, because there's filling up the bathtub with water, right? And I talked about all those things you can do yourself. Well, who else can help you fill up that bathtub with water, right? How can you fill those adrenals back and get them and keep them resilient and support them? And this is true even if you feel good, but you're going through a lot of stress and you don't want you to get depleted or to have a problem develop later. How can you prevent yourself from developing adrenal fatigue or, you know, adrenal dysfunction from this ongoing stressor that you have in your life right now? And so these are the things you can do in addition to the self-care things we talked about, like sleeping, eating antioxidant foods, and, you know, getting rid of the inflammatory foods we talked about last week, and decreasing toxins, and exercising, and managing stress, right? Those are the self-care things. You can go get help from somebody else. And this is where there are so many great people out there. I love acupuncture for this, and I imagine the acupuncturist could teach you acupressure points that you could do yourself. But I think an acupuncturist could be really helpful. I think things like massage therapy, cranial sacral therapy, any place where you go, and this is how I think of it as we were just talking about the mind-body connection of doing stress, of doing meditation or other kinds of mind-body techniques. The opposite of that I call the body-mind, right? If you have trouble sitting, you have trouble starting meditation, get someone else to help you. So you can enter relaxation through body work. And this is where acupuncture is great, massage, cranial sacral, oh gosh, I'm not thinking Reiki, you know, somebody to work with you. And if you have a lot of stress and trauma, and even traumatic, I do a lot of trauma work. And we all have little bits of trauma. So how long do I have?
3 minutes.
3 minutes left. My last little piece about trauma. We all have trauma. And it's not just our military soldiers and people coming back from, you know, war. And, you know, trauma is a very personal thing. And a traumatic event is just something that amps up our stress response in a much bigger way, and that we keep, every time we remember it, we have a stress response when we think about it, right? So it's a little bit of an ongoing reminder of something really traumatic. And so we all have trauma, and we all have traumatic events. And so I really discovered this great, if you find that you think that's you and you're stuck in repetitive sort of anxiety about things that have happened in the past, there's a great kind of therapy out there called somatic experience. And it's a therapist that teaches you how to meditate and have mind-body tools to manage your triggers. And so we all have to find tools to help turn everything, to turn it off, you know, to balance ourselves. We can't, the world will make us crazy. I'm not going to say anything about the election I did last week, but, you know, if you watch the news too much, or it's just, you know, all that comes into your body. It's your job for preventing chronic illness, because over time, and this is the last piece actually as we're winding down, what happens when your cortisol, you don't have the ability to make cortisol in response to stress. That's where you can develop inflammation, because cortisol is like your fire hose. It puts out the fire. And so you really want to have that resiliency in your adrenals so that you can manage the inflammation in your body. So be very careful in your own exposure to the news, and how much you let yourself get worked up, because that's a stressor. All right? So be mindful of your stressors and take good care of yourself. And that is the way, that you're going to keep your adrenals resilient. And if you have an inflammatory health condition, and I do this in my Immune System Recovery Plan book, right? In the Immune System Recovery Plan, 4 steps to healing your immune system: food, stress, gut, toxins. Stress, the whole stress piece. If you end up with adrenal fatigue or too much stress and your cortisol is pumping out for years and years, you can end up with autoimmune disease. It's one of the big triggers I see in autoimmune disease, and I forgot to even mention that. How do you like that? And I'm an autoimmune expert. And so cortisol and the stress hormones have a big effect on your immune system. Suppress the whole thing, pushes it in one direction. It amps up one part of your immune system while suppressing the other. Therefore, if you have autoimmunity, if you have chronic inflammatory disease of any kind, if you have brain fog or tired, all these things, suggest, you have to think about your adrenals as part of your overall program. It's likely not going to be the only thing. And the other thing that cortisol does, sorry, I guess I can keep going on about this. The other thing, and I promise I will wrap up, but I can't forget about mentioning the gut. Cortisol and the adrenaline that's released from the adrenals, they both go into your gut, and they increase leaky gut, and they change your gut flora, and they push your gut bacteria into a state of what we call dysbiosis, which we've talked about. So chronic ongoing stress doesn't only muck up your adrenals, but the adrenal response to stress mucks up your gut. So that brings us full circle back to gut, right? And so if you have any digestive symptoms, you must, in addition to doing a gut program, which, as you all know, I have an online gut program at blumhealthmd.com, you really also have to remember this stress piece is pushing you in the wrong direction. And so in order to fix your gut, you actually do need to address this stress and make sure that your adrenals are juicy and resilient. So I think I'm done. Yeah. All right. So see you all next week. We're going to put up another questionnaire, the survey, and we'll see what everybody wants to talk about next week. And and answer some of these questions. What I also do is I go back, as you all know, I go in and I'll answer them. If you leave comments here or questions, I will go in and answer them on Facebook. So you will get answers to your questions. And I look forward to seeing everyone next week. Have a great week. Oh, and next week it'll be almost Thanksgiving, which is hard to believe how time is flying. But I look forward to seeing everyone next week. And so have a great week.